Hello, I'm Juan Cartagena, President and General Counsel of Latino Justice PearlDef, and I'll be providing some historical perspectives on redistricting from a Latinx perspective. Redistricting in New York from Latinx historical perspectives. To start understanding the relationship between redistricting in New York, we have to start at actually Puerto Rican activism in New York City across the board. Progressive political activism in Puerto Rican communities between the two world wars in the mid-1990s were very, very robust. About 36 vibrant political associations resulted in a voter registration rate of about 50% of the Puerto Rican population in New York City in the mid-1900s, which is significant at that time. Vito Macaltonio Congress in East Harlem, Oscar Garcia Rivera Assembly Rep in East Harlem, and in Manbadillo Congress in Bronx of 1971. Each of these three were made historical milestones. My next name for you is Nydia Velázquez, who was elected to Congress in Brooklyn, New York, and Queens counties in 1992. So Vito Macaltonio was considered probably the first Puerto Rican congressman, even though he was Italian. It was because of his adamant, steadfast support for independence of Puerto Rico and for many causes for working class Puerto Ricans. Oscar Garcia Rivera made history as the first elected official for Puerto Rico in the history of the United States. Herman Badillo made history as the first elected congressperson to be elected in the history of the United States for Puerto Rican ancestry. Each of those three individuals, however, did not get their victories because of redistricting battles. In fact, they represent districts in which the concentration of Puerto Rican and other Latino voters was so high that literally no matter how the district would have looked, it would have been a majority Latino district. Nydia Velázquez is that exception. So Nydia Velázquez is a person who was only able to win after a redistricting battle. So her district, which covers 3 counties, is actually a better sign of how we have to deal with redistricting coming forward in this decade and beyond. In the 1970s, we had a false start. We thought we were going to get ready for redistricting battles in the Latino community. We could not because of the timing of some laws that were passed by Congress. First of all, in 1970, the redistricting cycle was the first time we had the 1965 Voting Rights Act, a significant piece of legislation in the history of civil rights. Section 2, which requires opportunity to elect, an equal opportunity to elect, today it still stands. It requires an analysis to make sure that you have enough members of a particular voting bloc to control a compact district, and that same voters, those group of voters, also suffer from the worst effects of racially polarized voting because white voters typically vote against their candidates, and that they're politically cohesive so that they always consistently support the Latino Latinx preferred candidate. That Section 2 is still the law today. But it also back in 1970s round of redistricting, we finally had Section 5, which prohibits discrimination because of intent or effect, but also prohibits it by requiring federal pre-clearance approval before an implementation. In 1971, Section 5 was first applied to New York, Bronx, and Kings County here in New York City, one of the few examples of Section 5's coverage outside of the Deep South. But New York State went to court immediately in 1971 to declare and got a court to agree that New York should not be subject to Section 5 because it did not use its literacy tests as a precondition for voting in New York State in a discriminatory manner. Back in the 1970s, you had to be literate in order to vote under New York constitutional law. The NAACP, however, went back to court after 1971 to reopen the case with the Department of Justice and convince them that, yes, there has been discriminatory use of literacy tests in New York City. And the answer for why or how is because it was an English-only literacy test which discriminated against Puerto Rican voters throughout the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. As a result of that, in 1974, the court orders those 3 original counties, Bronx, New York, and Kings, to be covered by Section 5, biggest protection of the Voting Rights Act. Unfortunately, it was too late for the 1970s redistricting, but as we will see now, it became an issue in the 1980s. The Latino redistricting wars continued in the 1980s with really a lot of momentum. It was the first time that redistricting would be subject in New York City or New York State to Section 5 requirements. Who was the first Puerto Rican to sue under the Voting Rights Act in Section 5? Gilberto Gerena Valentin, a councilman from Bronx County, who was really annoyed and livid over the fact that New York City would not create additional Latino and Black districts of city council. Look at these numbers. In 1970 to 1980, Blacks and Latinos made up 47% of New York City's population total, and yet the city council for the 1980s redistricting plan only created 8 majority minority districts out of 45, a ridiculous low number given the population growth from 70 to 80. New York tried to defend this by claiming there was amazing in New York City's residential housing patterns, which anyone who knows anything about New York in the 1970s knows and knew back then that was not true. Koch and the city council then went ahead and tried to hold their primaries for city without federal preclearance, which is what Section 5 requires. And that required then us, Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund, and many other attorneys at the time that we were working with, to go back to court and rush to court actually to stop the election. And we were able to stop the New York City primaries 2 days before the primary on September 8th. It was scheduled for September 10th. I would also know, for those of you who study this, that the 1980s rounds of redistricting in this particular case, Herrera-Valentin versus Koch and Heron versus Koch, really formulated the basis of the New York City voting rights bar between Latino African-American attorneys who used the Voting Rights Act to success, and soon thereafter, very soon thereafter, Asian American attorneys as well. And all of us have been working on these issues for quite some time, since the 1980s. The 1980s also saw a big battle for creating a second congressional Latino district. These are not battles that just happened 10 years ago with Adriano Espaillat. They happened decades ago. The battle to create a second district was anchored in Brooklyn. Brooklyn Historical District for Puerto Rican and Latino migration said that they had the numbers to control a district, and they were demanding one. Albany created a 45% Latino plurality district, but it linked Brooklyn with Lower East Side in Manhattan and El Barrio in a very oddly configured district. That district was opposed by Representative Shirley Chisholm and also Senator Vander Beatty because it diminished Black voting strength in Brooklyn. The Puerto Rican Legal Defense Fund submitted its own plan, which actually anchored the new district, the potential district in Brooklyn and Lower East Side only. But the Department of Justice actually eventually denied preclearance and rejected the plan for a second congressional district, finding that its effects in Brooklyn would be detrimental to Black voting strength in Kings County. As a result, Albany went back to the drawing board and created a 44% Latino plurality district, wholly cased in Brooklyn. And that eventually was pre-cleared, approved by the Department of Justice. So what happened? We should have gotten a second seat? No. Representative Ed Towns won that election. And why did he win a district that was about 44% Latino? Because 2 Latinos, Rafael Hernandez and Jack John Oliveto, decided to run against each other and split the primary vote, and therefore Mr. Towns won. In the 1990s, we went back, tried to create a second Latino congressional district, and this time in the 1990s, Latinos in Brooklyn, in Manhattan and Queens were able to elect the first Puerto Rican woman ever to be elected to Congress, Nidia Velázquez. One would think that was all good, right? Everything's fine. No. Diaz versus Silva was a lawsuit filed by a mix of white and Latino voters claiming that the plan that resulted in Nidia's district was a racial gerrymander. That is, that the primary purpose was based on race, to try to create a Latino district at the expense of other redistricting criteria. The court actually ruled that Latinos were not a community of interest, even when the community, no matter which borough they're at, was characterized by racially polarized voting. That is, they voted cohesively. The court actually ruled and accepted testimony from the plaintiffs in the case challenging Nidia's district that Colombians and Queens have nothing in common with Puerto Ricans and Lower East Side. And as a result, that community of interest, lack of community of interest, was another reason why the district had to be reconfigured. The court also made a reference to the fact that Asian Americans were a community of interest across these boroughs, linking the Chinatown of Sunset Park with the Chinatown of Manhattan in many ways. So a new plan was forced to be created. It had less Latino voters, and Nidia Velázquez won nonetheless. That district, her district, is still a plurality today, and it still encompasses more than one borough. The lessons here is that appearances matter. Whenever a district looks like it's too oddly configured, to actually reach, and looks like it's going out of its way to reach Latino voters, it is suspect. The second lesson that we have to draw is that Nidia Velázquez enjoys both incumbency, a record of excellent voting in Congress, name recognition, and these are powerful tools to be reelected in any kind of context, including Congress. So the battle continued. Nida's district was eventually created, but now the question is, can we create a third Latino congressional district? This battle was fought out last round of redistricting in 2010. And after the 2010 census, the Dominicans were demanding a district that was based in Washington Heights and Upper Manhattan, and also taking into account the Dominican migration into the Bronx County. That would pit, if you remember your history, the growing Latino Dominican vote in Manhattan and the Bronx against the seat of Black historic political power in New York City, and that is Central Harlem. And as we have seen, this issue became a major issue last time around in redistricting. Albany could not decide between the Republicans and the Democrats. They could not decide on a congressional plan. So what happens? They put their arms up in the air, said we can't figure it out. And Latino Justice Perldeff and many other groups went to court to force a redistricting in time for the congressional primaries. That case favors versus Cuomo included Latino voters that were able to intervene because of our efforts back then 10 years ago. A three-judge court was convened. A special master was appointed to actually draw the lines. Remember, because Albany could not get it together between the Republicans and the Democrats. So what happens? Latino Justice proposed a plan to create a third congressional district that encompasses parts of Upper Manhattan along with the Bronx, and that was part of a unity plan presentation between Latino Justice Perldeff, the Center for Law and Social Justice out of Medgar Evers College, and the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Our unity plan would include a third congressional district. There was a competing plan. It attempted to try to create a district between New York County, Bronx County, and Queens. We thought that that competing plan would run some suspicions, just like on the Nidas district 10 years before. So we proposed a two-county plan. Eventually, the court adopted a two-county plan, similar to what we proposed to the court and the special master, and created a New York and Bronx County third congressional seat. Adriano Espaillat, to his credit, eventually won that election and that seat in 2016, becoming the first Dominican in history of the United States to be elected to Congress, and also the first formally undocumented person to be elected to congressional office in the United States. The lessons here again now is that appearances also matter, that Nidia's lessons, her district lessons, we had to apply them to Washington Heights. Otherwise, we could have run the risk of losing a potential third district. It also reaffirms the seat of Black political power in Brooklyn as opposed to Harlem. So some people may look at this episode in 2010 and say, oh, there was a big shift between Dominican power, Latino power, and African-American power. You're not paying attention. That shift happened demographically decades before. That is, the registered number of voters in the Black community of Harlem was diminishing over time and decades, so that this was just a culmination of demographic changes in Manhattan and Bronx County. By the time we get to the 2010s, we were then forecasting, can we win other districts? And that was not easy to do because we just created a third Latino congressional district that eventually elected Espaillat. The only other one was in Queens and in the Bronx is the 14th Congressional Plurality District. That means it wasn't a majority Latino district. And even today, it hovers just below 50%. And those questions are, we're about 16% Asian American, 19% white. The Centro report that we're going to hear about in a minute estimates that Latino population grew in that district by 2% over the last decade. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez made history by defeating Joe Crowley in a primary in 2018 to capture the district with a Latino plurality, not a majority, giving her a lot of credit to how she was able to organize her campaign. The Centro now estimates in this report that you're going to hear about today that the total population decreased by about 3% in the New York 14th. And the Centro also reports on two additional districts that are actually led by two people who identify as Latino. One, Antonio Delgado up in Hudson Valley in Catskills, and the other one, Nicole Maliotakis out of Staten Island. Our lessons and our final lessons for this are pretty clear. We have been there and we've done this before. Whenever we have redistricting in which the delegation of New York State contracts, we have less seats available to us. We have definitely done this before. That is not new to us. We've been able to handle this before, although every time we do this is always a risk. Let's be clear that we have been able to preserve what we have in previous cycles. Contraction defined what happened 10 years ago when two parties were in charge. Senate's ruled by Republicans, the Assembly ruled by the Democrats. Now the question is, what will it be now? Because the Democrats control all those 3 positions in that room in Albany, those 3 seats in the room. Will that result in a clearer process and a unanimity in a way that protects the voting strength of Latino voters, African American voters, and Asian American voters? Time will tell. Secondly, will the process be amended? We'll talk about that in a minute with Fulvia de Vargas de Leon. She'll be able to talk to you about these things in detail. But redistricting does not guarantee success. That's another lesson that we've learned historically, and we'll learn it over again if we forget our history. 2 weeks before the congressional primaries of next year are not new to us. We've had to rush before. This time we'll rush even faster because, as will be noted later on in this program, you will hear how the census is delayed its release of the data in a way that gives us a lot of concern, but we can handle this too. So the bottom line here is we should be able to preserve, if we use all of our forces together, what we have and to eventually go beyond. Muchísimas gracias.